Good evening, everybody. My name is Fred Bertino. I am a MSTC consultant, and I've been a tutor with MST for many years now. I'm joined here with my partner in crime, Joe Hansen. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. How are you, Fred?
I'm terrific. It's going to be an awesome webinar tonight. We're tackling a pretty controversial topic here tonight, something that probably makes people's blood pressure rise when they think about it. But hopefully Joe and I are here to kind of calm the nerves and give you a nice kind of perspective to take upon this and realize that there is something that you can do to remain a very competitive applicant for this upcoming season. As I said before, my name is Fred Bertino. I've been a consultant and a tutor for MST for many years. I think it's coming on 7 or 8 years at this point. Joe, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been working with med school tutors for just a little bit less time than Fred. For about 5 years, I've worked as an individual tutor for board exams in medical school, everything from basic biochemistry medical exams all the way up through step 2 CS when that was a test, mainly emphasizing step 1, step 2. I worked with a ton of students from Caribbean schools, for medical graduates, you name it, to help them prepare for these exams and then prepare for residency. I'm hoping that some of my hundreds and thousands of hours experience with your colleagues will help me to provide you guys with some help and advice as you guys are navigating this treacherous environment of a pass-fail step 1.
I think between the two of us, with my experience of shepherding people into residency and Joe's experience of training you all to do amazing on these exams over the past several years, can hopefully create a pretty comprehensive idea of what to expect when going forward. So without further ado, let's jump forward here. At MST, we're a group of people, physicians, people in medical school who have done well on our exams and have made it into residency in all different types of fields, both residents and attendings. And we're all here to help you achieve your goals in whatever it is that may be. If you have questions regarding test prep or residency mentorship or just somebody to talk to about the process, you can reach out to us and let us know. We've got tons of people available to talk to you and help you out because you're our colleagues and will certainly be our future colleagues in these hospitals. And we want to help you out as best as we possibly can. I know Joe shares that sentiment. As he said before, he's been doing this for hundreds of thousands of hours. I'm going to fact check that, Joe. I'm not sure.
Hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands. I don't know if I've been alive for that long. But...
Well, I was going to say that's ridiculous. Anyway, things that we're going to be covering tonight is going to be basically, what does the pass-fail exam mean for step 1? How is this going to have any kind of impact on residency applications? And then more specifically, what can you do to stand out as an applicant? Now, obviously, we're catering to people who are probably getting ready to take the step 1 exam in 2022. This is going to be the first time that it's administered in a pass-fail environment. So we imagine that most of our audience today, I should say, are medical students who have not yet taken step 1 or step 2. So we will give you a little bit of a bird's eye view about what to expect on the exam of both step 1 and step 2 CK, some of the resources we recommend to prepare adequately for it, and why it would still be important to pass step 1. Despite it being a pass-fail test. And then as usual in MST fashion, we will have a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. We have a chat box. Please text in your questions that you have over the course of the webinar. You are not interrupting us. Send them into the chat. It's anonymous. We will read them all, including our amazing MST HQ secret spy 007 behind the scenes. Faith is also going to be shepherding these questions, telling us which are the most important things to mention. So please send them in over the course of our webinar, and we're going to answer as many as we possibly can. And of course, if things strike you later when we're answering them live, you just let us know. We're happy to take on as many as possible. So without further ado, why did we move to a pass-fail exam? Joe, having tutored so many students and having put a lot of hours into the preparation of this, can you comment a little bit about the rationale when it came to why we had to change to a pass-fail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic idea behind step 1 was always an exam to determine whether or not we had met minimum clinical competency for topics that you're supposed to learn during the first 2 years of basic science in medical school. The idea being that if we met that specific threshold, then we could move on to learn more clinical material in real time in the hospital, eventually moving on to take step 2 CK and then move fully clinically into residency thereafter. As a result, the exam has always been designed to create a minimum standard threshold for students to surpass, meaning that questions for the exam have always been written in a way so that the majority of students who understand the core material will be able to answer them correctly. Now, along with that, a 3-digit score was created that residency programs could then look at and directly compare the performance on this preclinical exam between applicants to the residency program. And because there are so few comparable numerical metrics that exist between medical students at different institutions from different backgrounds, it became especially tempting to utilize step 1 not only as a minimum competency threshold, but also as a direct comparison between medical students and applicants to residency. That being said, how well you do on an exam that is typically taken halfway through medical school does not necessarily represent who you're going to be as a clinical applicant for residency. And so now the USMLE, having seen how much emphasis is being placed on step 1, has kind of unanimously agreed that that was a little bit too much emphasis on basic science material. It turns out that whether you'll be a good clinician or a good house officer may not entirely relate to this 1 3-digit number that you received like 2 years before you apply to residency. So now we're going to pull back to a pass-fail standard to say, do you know what you need to know in order to go work in a hospital, to learn the more clinical advanced material that requires a little bit of basic biochemistry, basic microbiology, and that kind of immunology core concept stuff that you might not use every single day, but like would be useful for you to understand the bigger picture concepts that you will use in clinical practice. So they gave us plenty of warning on this. If you guys haven't seen this previously, they said this about 2 years ago, that January 26th would be the date in 2022. And what that means for you guys is that those of you who are considering taking step 1 sometime in the next year are going to be moving into a hybrid application process here, where some of your colleagues will have step 1 scores, some of your colleagues will not have step 1 scores. And so the relevancy of step 1 is going to start to fade to the background. And for those of you who are on the fence, should I take my exam like right now before we get to January or not? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, let's assume we're going to be taking the exam pass fail. That means that you are going to be entering into a match process potentially that have students who have scores for step 1. And so Fred and I will talk a little bit more about like what that means, how useful step 1 will be during this hybrid period. But for those of you who have a longer course planned ahead of you, maybe some of you are planning to do like the MD PhD route or something like that, then you don't have to worry. You don't have to think about it at all. In a couple of years, everybody will be pass fail. It's no longer a consideration. Most important thing that we want to emphasize tonight, though, is that even though the exam's going pass fail, which means that all they want to know is, can you do this? Do you have the minimum level of knowledge needed to pass this exam? It's crucially important that we do pass step 1. And so this does not mean, in our big thesis here, you can't just take it easy on step 1, even though it's going pass fail. You still have to treat this like a very serious test because it is required that we pass this, and really in your favor to pass it on your first attempt when you go into it. Fred, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was really, really spot on. I'll reemphasize the importance of passing on the first attempt in any scenario, because that really does come down to it. I think as step 1 moves to a pass-fail system, I think the number one thing that people can use as a discriminator between applicants is going to be whether you pass on the first try or you did not pass on the first try. And Joe, you and I were talking just before the webinar began, and you reminded me that the minimum passing score on step 1, while it will not be reported, okay, is raised now from 194 to 196. So I guess my question therein lies, and this is purely an opinion question, because obviously you or I have no way of understanding what the thought process of program directors are going to be. But do you think that if you're comparing a group of people who have a step 1 score in a 3-digit format versus people who have a pass-fail result, do you think that any one group is going to be at an advantage compared to the other group? Because I think that's probably a burning question for most of our listeners tonight.
Not necessarily. So the thing is that those students who are planning to take step 1 very soon, perhaps, and earn a score, can use that to help to amplify their application. But those who are receiving a pass-fail score taking the exam after January 26th ultimately have a bunch of other metrics to utilize. They just don't have step 1. Now, for students who were in the ballpark of earning a score around the passing mark, this ultimately ends up kind of removing step 1 from contention for those students. And so what that allows us to do is to start to amplify our effort into the things that will matter for them. It's kind of a mealy-mouthed answer, but the basic idea is, if you were on the fence about taking step one before the pass-fail deadline or after the pass-fail deadline. Ultimately, it depends on how prepared you feel in the moment, and we'll talk more about timing in just a bit, but suffice it to say, this isn't necessarily going to be a bad thing or a thing that will impair your application to residency. However, that being said, as we're about to remark, step one historically was kind of a playing field leveler for students, especially those who are applying from IMG programs or alternatively Caribbean programs. Usually step one can act as a mark of distinction for students who do quite well on it, and we are removing that by making step one pass fail. Once again, those students who would do really well in step one would likely do well in step two, et cetera. So it doesn't mean that this is going to impede people from achieving their goals. We just have to have alternative pathways to demonstrate our quality to residency application committees.
Awesome reply, Joe. I think that makes a lot of sense. In recap, then, people probably don't have anything to worry about.
Yeah, ultimately, I think everybody can stay calm and work towards learning as much as they can as they prepare for step one, which was part of the process that was lost in creating this 3-digit score that was all important, is that we started to lose the forest for the trees, starting to utilize step one as a mark of distinction without necessarily focusing on learning core concepts that would help students in the future, instead learning for the test rather than learning to be a better clinician, which is a pie in the sky concept, I know, but it's nice if we remove impediments to our clinical learning in that way.
Fantastic. I definitely agree with that. So that's good. So I guess let's jump into this a little bit more. With the recap of the pass fail change, what we're talking about here, the metrics for, I guess, standard evaluation was that, we wanted to create a level playing field, but when you have a standardized test like step one with a 3-score report, that wasn't, I guess, really all that standardized because it was a standard level of information, but it kind of scaled different applicants at different levels and made them eligible, or I should say more eligible for certain specialties versus other ones. We're getting rid of that. We're taking away the importance of what step one used to have, and we're probably going to shift that over to step 2 CK. Now, rest assured, step 2 CK is, while it will still be a numeric grade, it is an exam that more consistently tests your medical knowledge, practical things that you do need to demonstrate a strong command over because you will use them in the hospital every day. Questions on step 2 CK tend to be your thought process when it comes to ordering specific tests or coming to a differential diagnosis and picking a test that you can do to basically tease out a couple of things that otherwise may present very similarly. Very relevant, very clinical questions that are often asked. Step one is you're probably, or many of you, I should say, are probably in your basic science years. You're probably learning about the biochemistry, the physiology, the anatomy of things. And it's easy to get lost in the details. It's also very difficult to see how some of those details can be applicable to clinical medicine. Joe and I can be here all day and link these details to clinical medicine because he and I have studied these for years, and we've made so many linkages to why things are actually important from a practical standpoint. Oftentimes, these kinds of realizations aren't made until you've been practicing for a while. Joe's been doing this forever. I've been doing it forever. But when you're in the moment and studying it, it's probably not that concrete, and that's okay. I think the authors of step one clearly recognize this as well, and that's why they're putting less of an emphasis on the numeric score as the great divide between people when they're applying to residency.
Yeah, let me jump in there to say,
Sure.
I think what Fred is saying here is that maybe it's not so important that we know specific virulence factors for like diphtheria or something like that. In all likelihood, you're going to run into very few cases of diphtheria in your clinical practice, one would hope. And so as a result, learning the kind of like nitty gritty material that step one teaches you is helpful in an academic sense, but not necessarily something you're going to use in your career. And if we're trying to train people for the career of medicine, it kind of makes sense to de-emphasize step one if it doesn't have as much actual direct relevance to day-to-day practice. That being said, you can of course make the academic argument that knowing exactly how these things work is absolutely important to having a more global understanding of medicine and clinical practice in medicine. But ultimately, there's only so many hours in the day, and you're not going to necessarily make those connections until you're really practicing for a long time. You can't really get that kind of level of mastery over this material in the short time that you have before taking step one in the first 2 years of medical school. We've had a couple of good questions come in based on what we've said so far. I just want to quickly address these. One student had asked, well, if I am thinking about taking step one right now, and I could maybe land in like the 200, 210 category, that territory. Would it behoove me to take the exam now, or would it behoove me to take the exam in the pass-fail territory? Ultimately, for those of you who are on the fence right now, my argument would be that if you feel ready to pass the exam, you might as well take it. Ultimately, because any score that's greater than a 196, which is the new passing threshold as of January 26th, is inherently better than a simple pass on your transcript, because all the pass means is that you are over a 196 or at a 196, but any number that's greater than that on your transcript, 200, 205, 210, that is something that is better than just seeing the letter P on the transcript. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it amplifies your application a whole bunch, but if you're ready to take the exam, you should probably take it. Another student mentioned, well, can't I just tell programs what my practice assessment score said, or even better, couldn't I mislead programs and tell them, yeah, I got a 250 on the UWorld self-assessment? They probably won't take self-reported scores. So ultimately, we should take the numerical value out of step one altogether. Once we get to January 26, we no longer have to think about what our score would have been. Now you're using practice assessments as a tool to determine whether you're ready to take the exam, and that's it, without any assessment of how well you'll do when you take the exam.
Really good point, Joe. I'll probably add too that, when we had numeric scores, still now, but even in the past, there has been a slow increase in the average score of the result on step one. Sometimes about 10 years ago, it was probably around a 220. Now it probably approaches around a 230 as being the average score for the exam. That said, if you are scoring on practice exams at a numeric score before the change that is below the average score, it probably won't hurt you, because they realize that you will be competing with people with a P or an F on their application, because the P is basically a 196 or higher. That said, it may shine a spotlight on your score in the sense that they're going to want to see a above average step 2 CK score, because that score will still be reported. So if you got a 210 or something that was below the standard average on step 1 and had a 3-digit score reported, like a 205 or something like that, the program directors may just chalk it up to a fluke and say, well, it was going pass fail anyway. They passed, it's perfectly fine. But if you come back with a step 2 CK score that's still below average, that's probably where the great divide will take place. So make sure that you're putting the work in as if you were studying for this exam, as if it is a score that will be reported, because I think that will, one, build excellent study habits for your step 2 exam. And two, when it does come time to take the one that's actually graded, you'll already know how to prepare for a test like this.
Absolutely. And if you'll let me jump in here, Fred, just to add, this brings us to answering the second part of another student's question, which was, well, what do I do to make myself look good for residency applications then? If I don't have step 1 to help me out, what am I supposed to use instead? And one of the most important things that we can use is step 2 CK. Like Fred was saying, that is now the one single numerical value that all medical students will be earning before they match into residency, and ideally before they apply to residency programs. And so as a result, step 2 CK gains a lot more emphasis for anybody who's taking step 1 per pass fail. And just to reiterate to another question we received, just to work backwards a little bit, let's say that we've already taken step 1 and we got a score that was in the passing range, 210, 200, 220. Would we be at a disadvantage compared to students who are getting a pass grade on the exam? Now, again, these are individual opinions that we have. I cannot speak for every single residency program out there when it comes to their evaluation criteria. However, by and large, no, you will not be at a disadvantage if you have a numerical score in the passing range, if you're being compared to students who have a simple pass or fail, ideally pass, on their application, their transcript, mainly because pass simply means that you got a score that currently is at a 194 or above, or by January 26th at a 196 or above, which means anything greater than that is gravy. It means that you at least did as well as the other people who have a pass on their application, so far as the residency program knows. So anything greater than a 196 helps to, at least in some small way, amplify your application. That being said, some programs are going to be seeking some above average superlative performance on the part of applicants to their programs. And in that case, step 2 offers you the opportunity to demonstrate that kind of superlative performance and demonstrate your quality for that program. Along with that, other things that we can use to amplify our application, not including Step 2 CK with its numerical value, include clinical grades on individual clinical rotations, whether we received honors, high pass, pass on all of our rotations that we took during our third year, letters of recommendation garnered from faculty that you've been working with, ideally mainly faculty like in the fourth year, but maybe even some from third year during your core clinical rotations, and the mechanism by which a lot of these letters are gained, audition rotations and away rotations. And these are going to be really important because that helps you to get your foot in the door at programs that you really like, to introduce yourself and let them know you. And because we don't necessarily have the ability to show a superlative Step 1 score anymore, instead your cover letter, so to speak, might be your performance on a rotation that you actually did at that particular hospital. I'll point out too that you can do research experience, publications, things like that. I think Fred will make the case that those are a little bit less important when it comes to applying to residency, but they're still valuable and they definitely don't hurt us to have some research experience on your application. So Fred, with that being said, I've kind of hyped up the importance of Step 2 CK. You mentioned it a little bit. When should we take Step 2 CK then? Because some students might be of the mind that they would like to take Step 2 CK after submitting their applications to residency, and just get that passing score for Step 2 CK in there before rank lists are submitted in, well, in a couple months now, but next year, ostensibly for the next cycle.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joe. I think in the past, what had happened was that you could, with a numeric Step 1 score going into your application, you could send your application in and then didn't have to risk the chance of getting a lower Step 2 CK score and ruining your chances at getting a residency. I think now there will be an expectation that Step 2 CK scores be reported before the applications go in, or at least within a reasonable time frame after. I know that when I applied, I didn't have my Step 2 CK score able to be sent in with my application on ERAS, but it was uploaded within about 2 to 3 weeks, just based on the score reporting. I found that helped me in particular to get many interviews at different residency positions. But at the same time, now that there's really no divide with Step 1, Step 2 CK's importance is higher. So I think having that score in your application, or at least peripheral to it, like within the few weeks that follow the submission deadline, is going to be imperative for you to be taken seriously when being offered interviews in your upcoming application season. We'll get into a little bit more about the timeline of how to prepare for these exams as we go a little further into our talk tonight. But did that answer your question, Joe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so just to echo what you were saying there, Step 2 gains importance. And so it's nice to have that with your application. And so part of the major advice that we'll be giving to you guys this evening is to supply Step 2 in your application for residency, or as soon as you're capable of putting it in there, so as to help garner more interviews for yourself, because that will be a major factor that programs will be considering going forward. And we can no longer simply give a good Step 1 score and then hide our Step 2 CK score from programs. If that was ever a strategy, it's not one now. Gotcha.
When it comes to Step 3, I'll make a special note here to say that really it's only available to those eligible to take it. As our audience tonight may primarily be IMGs, realize that this is only going to be your eligibility for Step 3 only comes after you achieve ECFMG certification and you have a medical school diploma, because applying for that exam happens in a slightly different route than what you've previously done for Step 1 and Step 2. And if you haven't registered for the exam yet, that's okay. You'll learn about how to register for Step 1 and Step 2, but Step 3 is a little bit different. If you don't have those two things, then it's going to be really hard for you to take Step 3. I only bring this up because many international medical graduates come from other schools that they've been practicing medicine for many years in their home countries and are coming over to the United States to do this. So they're really eligible for Step 1, 2, and 3 right off the bat. So those people would be eligible to take it. For most people going through the traditional medical school pathway, whether that be in the Caribbean or in another country, and you have not achieved that medical school diploma or have gotten ECFMG certified, you will not be able to take Step 3 at that point. So just something to keep in the back of your minds. Now, historically, you could go back to the NRMP charting outcomes of the match, and you can see a lot of graphs like this. These were reported for step 1 and step 2 scores. This specifically here is going to be a step 2 CK score chart that you're seeing. And I bring this up because this basically shows the ranges of those who matched in blue and those who did not match in a seafoam green. I'm going to break out my expert use of color here. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong.
But on the top, I concur with your color appellation there.
Wrong, it's teal. No, I'm kidding. So the US IMGs are up at the top. Non-US IMGs are here at the bottom. These basically just mean US citizens who went to medical schools not in the United States. And then these are non-US citizens who went to medical school outside of the United States. And you can see that the darker blue are those ranges of those students who matched into a specialty, and those green bars are the ones who did not match into the specialty. And this is regard to step 2 CK scores. This data is publicly available. You can go to the NRMP website. This is the organization that you will use to buy a match token when the time is appropriate, when you're applying for residency. But they do publish this objective data every year, and you can kind of see target goals of what you would hope to get if you wanted to match into a specific specialty. As tutors, Joe and I will always recommend that you aim for the highest possible score you can get, because options are your friend in this case. You don't necessarily want to be shuttered out of anything before you have a chance to apply or really experience it on the wards. I guess that's more important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just emphasize that the main thing you should take away from those charts is that, generally speaking, whether you're a US IMG or non-US IMG, by and large, the blue matched bars are higher than the seafoam green teal bars for those who are unmatched, meaning by and large, higher scores correlate to more success with matching. You'll notice that there are some kind of weird trends that you can find in there, mainly because step 2 CK simply is not the only variable that determines matching, and there are other variables included in there. And you can find that some students will end up matching at very high tier programs despite not having what you might consider the best scores, because of their connection to that program developed through away rotations, research projects, etc. And so as a result, there is not going to be a literal one-to-one correlation between these things. But you also have to consider that there are only so many tools in your control, only so many variables that you can manipulate while you're preparing your application for residency. And so, as usual, Fred and I will say, do what you can to control what you can. And so get the highest step 2 CK score possible to keep those doors open, to keep those options open for you, and mainly to secure a greater likelihood of matching at all.
I really love how interventional radiology and physical medicine and rehabilitation were more likely to not match people with higher scores.
I wasn't going to call you out for IR, but there's some wild stuff going on there.
There really is some wild stuff going on.
Bars there for non-US IMGs, which simply is to say that it's probably a small number of applicants we're considering, which means the standard deviation is very large. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue a high score just because we see some individual aberrations there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to call plastic surgery out here too for the US IMGs as well. But excellent point. These are all standard deviations. Isn't data fun?
It's wonderful. I love it.
Here we have some examples of the likelihood of your number of research experiences that go into what determines if you have been matched or not matched. Interestingly enough, you might notice another backwards trend here where people, especially non-US IMGs with lots of research experiences, more than their matched counterparts, were more likely to not match despite having a higher number of research experiences in certain fields. This is a trend that I'm going to hypothesize may flip a little bit now that step 1 is not going to be as important. I say this with pure speculation. I don't know this for sure. I can't speak for every program director looking out there, because realize many programs for residency out there are not necessarily focused on your research ambitions. They're focused on your clinical ability. And I would argue that the majority of these programs are quite clinically heavy. That said, there are always a certain number of fields that tend to be more competitive for one reason or another, many of them being surgical subspecialties that probably want to see that you've gone above and beyond to try to contribute something to the literature before you apply for their very competitive training program. The red arrows in both of these are pointing really to the same specialties, but these tend to be the one that we, at least through our MST data, have the majority of international medical graduates applying to. So I just kind of pointed those out. So if you see something that you are most interested in, you can check it out. Of course, this is not an all-inclusive list. It's just the ones where specialties are tracked.
Yeah, and I'll point out that you will see again some kind of bizarre deviations here where it appears that for those US IMGs that are applying from, say, Caribbean school, it looks like neurological surgery hates research according to this chart, insofar as those who are not matched tend to have way more research experiences than those who are matched. Another way to look at this data too is simply to say that there is a little bit of a weird correlation issue happening here where students who unsuccessfully match multiple times or who elect not to enter into the match process in order to bolster their application only have so many means by which they can bolster their application after finishing medical school. One of those would be taking a research year, doing a research project. And what we might find for this particular type of data is that there's not necessarily a good correlation between research experiences and matching, simply because those students who are less likely to match are more likely to lean on this category or have the time and wherewithal to improve this particular category, despite the fact that they are not good match candidates in that particular field as it is. That being said, this is one of the tools that we have to amplify our application, and we would be remiss to not utilize this tool. So try not to look at this to think that research is not valuable. In many fields it is, but it's not the only valuable thing. Again, a robust application with a good Step 2 CK score in some research is probably superior to having a great Step 2 score in no research, or amazing research and a barely passing Step 2 score. We want to be as well-rounded as possible for a lot of fields. It depends on the individual field though.
So in other words, Joe, just to summarize, it's sounding like if you have an opportunity to do research, you should leave no stone unturned and at least go for the opportunity, try to contribute to something to the field, because having the research can certainly not hurt your application. It can only help. But if you don't have those experiences available or opportunities available to you, don't fret, because the majority of the time it's a statistically insignificant result between having research and not having research. So it certainly can help, but it's not the end all.
Absolutely. And very few cases would research make or break an application. The presence of research is more like a checkbox that maybe amplifies slightly the likelihood of getting an interview at a specific program, depending on their research emphasis, of course. Some programs might really want to see research. So don't take our word for it when we say that it's important, but not the most important. It really does depend on what you're applying to, so take that into consideration as well.
Absolutely. So Joe, having, again, taken people through the course of Step 1 for as long as you have, when is the best time to take this now that it's pass fail? And can you give us a little bit of indication as to know when the right time is going to be?
Yeah, to set the stage here just a little bit, Step 1 becomes a little bit of a weird orphan exam now, because technically there's no rule that states that you must take Step 1 before you take Step 2 CK as far as the USMLE is concerned. So some individuals might think, why don't I just wait to take Step 1 until the latest possible time, maybe at the end of medical school? In many cases, if you are a US IMG and you're at a program that's perfectly associated with the US, like a Caribbean school, for instance, they will force you to take Step 1 before advancing through your degree. But for those who are intending to apply to the US from a non-US medical school, you might make the choice for yourself to wait to take Step 1 because there's no actual in-curriculum reason for you to take it at your program. Here's the argument that I'm going to make here. Step 1 only becomes more difficult to pass as time progresses after the first couple of years of medical school. I'm aware that many programs that are not in the US do not put the right, or maybe not correct to say the word right, but don't put the same emphasis into Step 1 preparation that US schools do in the first 2 years. And you may make the case that you may not be in your best fighting shape to pass Step 1 after finishing the first 2 years of medical school outside the US. Granted, that might be the case. Nevertheless, as Fred mentioned before, Step 1 preparation teaches you test-taking skills and studying skills that you will then utilize in your clinical rotations. Depending on your curriculum, if you have the time and wherewithal to prepare for Step 1, before starting your core clinical rotations, before starting your shelf exams, if you have OSCEs or shelf exams in your program, before getting ready for Step 2 CK, is the best possible option, because it gives you the ability to kind of warm up with using practice questions and learning how these exams are usually written, how questions are presented, on step one, where you get a pass or a fail score, hopefully a passing score, and then you can move into step two preparation with your eyes open and more knowledge of how these exams actually go. So for those of you considering, maybe I'll flip-flop them, maybe I'll take step two first and then I'll take step one. I would make the argument that step one is a valuable teaching tool towards step two, and that we're not necessarily gaining the benefit that we could be gaining from step one if we flipped the order. So then the question becomes, when do I take step one? Because it can be really difficult to fit it in. And my suggestion is this: if you feel that you're confidently capable of passing step one, meaning you have multiple passing practice assessments, that is the time to take step one at that point, as soon as you feel very confident that you will pass. And for students that I work with, I typically suggest that we should feel subjectively 90 to 95% confident that we're going to pass step one before we go in to take it. We shouldn't really leave anything to chance. Now, whether you're able to really quantify how likely you are to pass step one is a different issue. Currently, the way that the MBME and UWorld self-assessment practice exams are scored, I usually tell students if they're getting a 200 or especially a 205 or higher consistently on their practice tests, they are now very, very likely to pass and they should move in to take the test. So as it stands right now, those are the metrics by which I would say you should take step one at this date. Mm-hmm. Do you feel prepared? Are you getting passing practice assessment scores? Will you pass the test? If so, go for it, take it. If not, under no circumstances should you go into the exam feeling like you are unlikely to pass. There is no reason to put yourself at risk of getting a failing mark on step one for your transcript. You should always wait in that case. Anything to add to that, Fred?
No, that was perfect. I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. I'm going to emphasize that confidence in knowing your likelihood to pass the exam. And I'll echo that for sure. It sounds like what you're kind of hinting here, Joe, is that you need to kind of prepare for the exam as if it were graded, because that's really going to kind of give you the step ahead to know that you're going to pass the exam. It's going to give you the wherewithal to know how to prepare for step 2 CK, which is not unlike the preparation needed for step 1, with very similar style questions, just with different subject matter. So all really poignant points. Thanks for clarifying.
Of course.
And I think that kind of brings us to kind of this moral of the story here, because what is the point of the pass-fail step 1 at all? And really what program directors have historically used step 1 to really delineate is that, will you pass your boards when you are an internal medicine resident graduate or general surgery residency graduate or anything? You know, you will have subspecialty boards to study for. And I can speak from experience, many of these board exams do test some degree of minutia with, you know, some connection to what your residency was in. So can you study minutia enough to pass it, even though you may never really see it again in your entire practice of your life? And that's really kind of what step 1 is asking you to do. They know that it's probably not the most clinically relevant, but they need you to know it, because this is an exercise for the rest of your life when it comes to taking board exams. Now, whether you agree or you disagree with the ethics of doing something like that from an exam standpoint, one, I can say certainly get in line, because there's a lot of people who question the ethics of medical board exams. But 2, if you really want to do this job, this is one of those things that you have to be okay with living with on a day-to-day basis, knowing that you're going to have to be tested throughout your career. So why not practice? Why not put your best foot forward now while you have the time to understand what it means to study this material, so that you don't have to worry about getting the habits down to prepare for exams like this in your future. I can tell you from experience that really good test preparation as a medical student, as you guys all know from having studied for your courses, but also now preparing for step 1, you are now building the blocks of what it will take to do well on your specialty board exams. I'm somebody who just passed them. And if it wasn't for that foundation that I learned how to study for these tests from the beginning, I don't know if I would have done as well. So I think that in and of itself is just a really good skill that you know that you can use to really do well in your careers, because this is that paperwork thing that hospitals are going to require you to check off, and they expect you to pass these things. And as we said before, you really want to prepare for this test as if the people before you, Joe, myself, your colleagues just a year ahead of you, have prepared for this exam, because it'll be graded the same, maybe even a little harder, because the failing score now is a little bit, or the passing score is now a little elevated from 194 to 196. The only difference here is that the score isn't going to be shown to you or your program director. So while it's going to be anonymous or unknown, it'll still be graded in the same way, and the material that it will test will also be the same. So preparing for it as if there is a likelihood of not passing the test is going to be very beneficial to you moving forward.
Yeah, let me echo that and reemphasize that by saying that a lot of what we've talked about this evening is to emphasize that step one isn't going to be as important as it used to be. We have to pass it, sure, take it seriously, but really, really want to emphasize here, take step one very seriously, because there are a ton of students who work as hard as they possibly can to pass step one and do well on it, who nevertheless currently, under the current grading schema, do not earn a passing score on the test after weeks and months of dedicated preparation for the exam. That will likely not change very rapidly for step one, if it ever changes at all. The students who are preparing for step one right now are preparing with the same rigor that students have always prepared for step one. So if the passing threshold, 194, 196, whatever the 3-digit number would be, if that represents maybe, let's say, the 6th percentile of test takers on the exam, that's still going to represent the 6th percentile of hardcore test takers on January 26th. It's not going to be just everybody walking into the test and trying it out after making it through their coursework exams in medical school. So the one thing that Fred and I really have to emphasize is that, unfortunately, even though the exam goes pass fail, the preparation for the exam still has to be extremely rigorous. And that does help you for step 2 CK down the line, which is a nice ancillary benefit. But we were really saying that the primary motivation of studying hard for step one is just to guarantee that we do not get a failing score on it. So do not walk away from this thinking that, oh, good, it's pass fail. Whew, I can not worry about it anymore. It's still very difficult. And, use Fred as an example here, saying that he had to bring all his skills to bear to pass his specialty board exams. And this is a guy who's got 17 diplomas behind him in every video conference that he does, which I'm never going to get over how many things are on his wall there. But even people who are very well accustomed to passing these standardized exams are going to have to put effort into board exams, whether that's step one, step two, or IM, surgical, whatever board exams. So this is a real opportunity for you to develop studying skills, but it's imperative that you work hard for step one, no matter when you take it.
I'll say this too. I never really knew how doctors got all the diplomas. You walk into their office.
Theft? Did you steal them?
Well, no, you do this for 15 years, between pre-med and then a ridiculously long fellowship and residency. And then one day, 20 of them just show up on your doorstep. And it's just oh, great. I guess I'll hang these up in an office now. Because I don't know, you go to any of your doctor's office, there's always a wall full of diplomas. They accumulate. I don't know. It just happens. But I am proud to say that this is not a virtual background. I achieved this. This is my wall of achievement. I've affectionately named this wall my mom's refrigerator, because that is where the achievements go. Moving forward with step one resources and adequate preparation. We at MST have been doing this for a really long time. And we do consider ourselves experts in this field. We have a lot of people who have passed the exam with flying colors. Of course, now moving forward to 2022, we're really not going to know what those flying colors are going to be. We're just going to be able to say that they passed the exam. But that's not going to stop us from excellent preparation. And I think our strategy comes down to, one, experience, but two, having lots of students gone through this process and studying for the test. Joe and I pride ourselves on being pretty minimalist people. And I think everybody at MST kind of echoes that and understands that while there are a myriad of resources out there to prepare for this, it's probably better to do a few resources quite deeply rather than many resources only skimming the surface. Joe, can you elaborate a little bit more about your resource strategy, choosing them or going forward with them?
Yeah, currently students who are planning to take step one generally are going to use some kind of resource that gives them a lay of the land. First aid is the resource of choice for this. They use a resource that provides high quality practice questions. And our opinion at Med School Tutors, and my personal opinion, is that UWorld is the best resource for practice questions. There are a bunch of other practice question resources out there. UWorld is enough in and of itself. There's like 3,000 plus questions in there now. It's just way too many, it feels like. And so we do not need any other question banks other than UWorld. And I strongly encourage, if you have not fully completed UWorld, that's your first priority when it comes to practice questions. And that should, in fact, take up the majority of your time and effort. If you like AMBOSS, Kaplan, USMLE, those guys can be utilized too. But we generally like UWorld, and there's certainly no reason to use more than one question bank in preparing for step one. I'd rather see students complete UWorld, for instance, entirely through, rather than diversifying and not completing a single question bank from top to bottom. In addition to that, as Fred was mentioning, minimalism here means not going too crazy with resources, but I still like to suggest that you have some kind of main bread and butter resource to teach you the fundamentals in physiology, pathology, microbiology, and pharmacology. And so to that end, Pathoma is the gold standard for pathology. Sketchy is the gold standard now for micro, and is pretty good for pharmacology as well. And then there's kind of a split thinking here between using a review text like BRS for physiology, or sub-selecting individual videos from Boards and Beyond, which is a massive resource that has tons of stuff, but you would be pulling out specifically physiology to supplement the pathology you're learning from Pathoma and the micro and pharm that you're learning from Sketchy. But the basic idea that we're getting at here in terms of like how to prepare for step one is do thousands of practice questions, make sure that you have a resource that allows you to do memorization of high yield data, and that's going to be first aid's job to give you lots of tables and diagrams with specific things to memorize, and then get core concepts by reviewing major review resources like Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, BRS Physiology, and Sketchy. And just to kind of give you a general perspective, students currently, whether in the US or foreign medical graduates both, usually spend several weeks in dedicated preparation before taking step one. And this means somewhere in the ballpark of 6, 8+ weeks just preparing for step one. And that's how long it would take to fully cover a lot of these resources. It's a big time investment, and that is not a time investment that should change anytime soon. Furthermore, a couple of students have been asking about just step one itself, like how applicable are these resources going to be once the exam changes, once we get to January 26th? The answer is the exam's going to be exactly the same. So those of you who are asking, well, are the quality or style of questions or the content of questions on the exam going to change now that we're going to pass fail? No, the intent of the exam remains the same, to determine whether or not you have the minimum standard material knowledge to be a good clinician, to move on to clinical work. The purpose of the exam from the perspective of USMLE has always been the same. It's not changing. The exam's not changing. The only thing that's changing is the way they're reporting their score, your score, to you, which means the same principles for preparing for the test that exist right now will be entirely the same come January 26th. So for students who are preparing to take step one, who just aren't going to be able to take it before January 26th, might be taking it like February 10th, February 15th, whatever, they're preparing just the same as students who are taking the exam on January 20th. That will not change in the near future. So these would still remain key resources, and that would still remain the main fundamental strategy to utilize lots of practice questions, high yield material, and core concept bread and butter material. Anything to add to that, Fred?
Well, I have another question about how you would prioritize certain things. So, I mean, I know that you and I have gone on record multiple times saying that, you know, first aid is an amazing resource. It's been around now, I guess, for 31 years when you think about it, maybe coming on 32 years in 2022. And, you know, this is kind of like the syllabus. If you open up step one, you know, first aid for the USMLE, it's like a syllabus. It's kind of bullet points information. It's long lists of things. It's things that it's telling you that you have to really have a good command of, even just memorizing those facts in order to even think about answering questions correctly on the exam. And then as we move into UWorld, or a really great question bank like UWorld, and I do believe it still is the industry standard, UWorld is going to be more the textbook rather than your assessment tool. You know, you want to think about this as something to be something you can read and learn from rather than constantly perseverate over what kind of numbers or scores you're getting here. But then we get into this supplemental stuff. And I caution students about using too many supplemental resources here. And I see one with I have great disdain for, And that's going to be the Anki logo, mainly because I just don't think it's feasible to try to get through like 20,000 plus flashcards on random facts in no particular order, without any organization. Do you recommend this to people? I mean, like, what's the best way to use this, if at all?
You guys will notice that I carefully avoided mentioning the Anki logo so as to not get an angry tirade from Fred. But
Well, my blood
nevertheless,
pressure's spiked now, so deal with it.
So I would argue that flashcards are in the hands of the user essentially here. If you are a flashcard person, Anki can be a great tool for you to utilize flashcards that come from some resource that you're already working with. There are plenty of aggregate decks for Anki out there, including Zonki or Anking or what have you. New ones are always developed, but they're always taking details and facts from first aid, from UWorld, and maybe even from the ancillary resources like Sketchy, which means that if you're doing a thorough job of reviewing these other resources, Anki no longer becomes a mandatory thing to do because it doesn't have any novel information that you're not seeing elsewhere. So I do see students trying to do the impossible, trying to do what Fred describes as getting through 30,000 flashcards before they take step one. I didn't use really any flashcards for step one personally, so I can personally vouch that they are not necessary to succeed on the exam, although they might be useful and beneficial. But I would argue that you should use them to the degree that they're beneficial. Unlike UWorld, which I would say do the questions in UWorld, absolutely vital. Anki and any kind of flashcard resource would be, to the degree that you find utility in it, do it. But rather than saying you should try to finish this comprehensive 30,000 card deck, I would say flashcards are best utilized for a specific amount of time. And so if you have 30 minutes on like a train ride or something, or you have 30 minutes that you want to use in the evenings to cool down after studying, or you want to look at flashcards while you're at the gym on the treadmill or something like that, and you have exactly 40 minutes of running to do, I would argue that you should use flashcards for a designated amount of time every evening rather than setting a numerical goal for flashcards completed. And if you don't finish all of them, then well, you don't finish all of them. You're still seeing that content in other resources. So Fred and I are kind of one mind about the flashcards. I would say to whatever degree you like using them, use them, but you should not make a goal of finishing everything because you've got other stuff to do.
Fair. And that also said, with the supplemental resource, it's used as an as-needed basis. Having a copy of Setar and Costanzo on your bookshelf when reviewing concepts in first aid and UWorld are great. I think it's really important to be able to have something that you can pull off the bookshelf, open to a page, really get a little bit more of an in-depth, a little bit more detailed explanation of something to help you achieve that light bulb moment of understanding, and then close the book, pop it right back on the shelf, and then only take it down again when you need another one of those pieces of enlightenment. First aid and UWorld are both incredibly capable of getting you an incredibly, I'll say historically, excellently passing score, and to those of you taking it after January 2022, perfectly capable of getting you a passing score. Don't worry too much about skimming the surface of all of these other resources that you might hear whispers from your colleagues and friends. Everybody's going to tell you that their resource is going to be the best one. What really matters here is what works well for you. And the two that are tried and true for years and years and years are the first two you see there, step one, USMLE, first aid, and UWorld. For Joe, we really should be getting royalties from these companies because we don't.
Yeah, I should stress that we are not being compensated
we're not.
in any way for
we really aren't
resources.
Compensated. We have no disclosure.
We're choosing the ones that we think are best, for better or worse, because UWorld's making me angry with how many questions they're publishing all the time. If you buy the question bank right now, you'll find by the time you're done, they'll add 5%, 10% more questions. And my recommendation to complete the entire Q bank becomes more and more hard to stomach as time goes on and the Q bank inflates in size. With that being said, we're about to show a kind of calendar of how you might prepare like a study schedule for step one. And as I mentioned before, kind of like an 8-week calendar was historically the norm, but the resources are pretty robust. And so getting through all of the resources in 8 weeks might not even really be feasible. Now you can still get a lot done in 8 weeks, and it's a good chunk of time to recommend, but this is just kind of a sample calendar of like, what a study schedule might look like as you work your way through a couple of organ systems per week and start taking practice assessments building up to exam day. But the big emphasis here is not so much on how you construct your study schedule, but more to say, you still got to have one. Even if the exams pass fail, it's still necessary for you to have a coherent and concrete plan to get through the material and prepare as best as you can, which includes, if at all feasible, setting aside a fairly large chunk of time to make this your job to prepare for this exam. Anything to add to like our strategy for like our calendar creation, Fred?
Not really. I'll say that, there's a couple questions coming to the chat that we're asking about. Is this with regard to first aid or UWorld? And I will say the two have never been separate. That's the optimal studying schedule. That is the enlightenment that you must first understand, is that UWorld and first aid are one. And you have to use them as one for full comprehension. I think Joe will agree with me on that.
To specify and clarify on that a little bit, if we say like do a day studying for cardio, in preparation for step 1 and eventually for step 2, a typical dedicated study day would include around 10 hours of studying, meaning a full-time job worth of studying, which would typically include around 2 full blocks in UWorld or 80 questions, along with maybe some ancillary videos in Pathoma or Sketchy, and then some light review in first aid in the same category that you're reviewing. So you would do 80 questions in cardio, and then you would look at, say, Pathoma, the vascular chapter or the cardiac chapter, and then you would glance at the pathology subsection of first aid for cardiovascular material as well. So when we say do cardio for a day, that basically means 80 questions in that particular system that we're referring to. That's usually kind of like digestible amount of material to do in one day, because the routine pace I'd like to suggest students aim for is at least 10 questions per hour in UWorld, which means 80 questions is 8 hours. And then you would have about an hour to an hour and a half of video watching, and then 30 minutes of drilling flashcards first aid utilization to fill out a 10-hour study day. And that's a lot to study for 10 hours per day. I'm just going to throw my weight here and say 10 hours is a perfectly reasonable study day. If you're talking to people who are studying for like 14 plus hours, that's crazy to me. That is not necessary to perform well on the exam. You might find other people who disagree, but I will point out that at the very least, there's disagreement there. It is not the case that you have to study for absurd lengths of time per day. 10 hours is already a pretty substantial amount to devote effort towards this stuff.
Totally agree. Let's fast forward to step 2 CK. Joe, when is the best time to take this test, and what really has to go into it to make sure that you're putting yourself in a great position for applications?
Yeah, this one's a little bit trickier than step 1 now, because step 1, we're saying take it when you feel like you're confident you're going to pass. But step 2, we really are advocating that you get the best possible score. And so the ideal date to take this would be when you're ready to earn a strong score, but also as early as you can, so as to be able to supply your step 2 CK score with your initial ERAS application. Now, as Fred mentioned, this isn't always entirely possible, and it may not be entirely necessary to have your step 2 score when you submit your application to ERAS, when schools are first able to look at your application materials. But because this is the one numerical score we have now, it's going to be more and more imperative that you have that bundled with your application. So your kind of deadline here to take the test is more or less when you plan to apply for residency. But at the same time, you shouldn't take the exam too early if you feel that you're not earning the optimal score. So generally speaking, for students who are US IMGs or students at US allopathic schools, I will tell them that they should probably take step 2 CK as soon as they're able to after they finish their core clinical rotations. That might not always be possible, but that places you as close as you can to your primary learning of the clinical material and gives you the best opportunity to get the highest score. But if your curriculum is organized in a different manner, or it's been a while since you've been in medical school, now your goal is just get a strong score and have the exam done to supply that score with your application. Some things to consider here is, did you take shelf exams? Have you done all your core rotations? Have you done well enough on them that you feel like you can launch into taking step 2 CK or preparing for it for more dedicated study time? Another thing to consider is, when are you submitting your ERAS application? Are you taking some time before submitting it? Are you applying next cycle rather than this current cycle? Also, consider that if we're looking at what field you're going into, step 2 CK may or may not have more relevance. There are some fields based on those match statistics that we listed before that are going to require competitive scores to have a high likelihood of matching, in which case we may consider just altering our plans altogether if we can't get that kind of score at the moment when we're planning to take step 2 CK. And then of course, anything else you have in your application to supply, strong letters of recommendation, research experiences, things of that nature can help to give you a gauge as to what does it mean to have a strong step 2 score. We are not going to say a specific number because that's different for every individual, but whatever you think you need to supply the application that you feel comfortable supplying, when you can get that score, you should take the test. And if the deadline's approaching, then you have to start making harder choices about whether you want to take the exam to apply this cycle or delay applying to residency in some cases. Anything to add to that, Fred?
No, I think that was fantastic. It's like you said, it's a really personal decision as to when to do this the right way. And a little bit more strategy now has to be applied because you're actually going to get a numeric score. And this is going to be the thing that most likely separates or creates that divide that I was talking about earlier. Fortunately, this one doesn't necessarily go into what specialties you may choose to apply to, because oftentimes you may take your step 2 CK after you have applied to your specialty, and that's okay. I think you should put your best foot forward, do your best on this exam that you possibly can. Rest assured that the material on this test is very clinically relevant. It is not impossible to do quite well on this test with the right preparation. And the things on it are very applicable to your day-to-day life in a hospital, no matter the field. So, putting your best foot forward on this exam is a lot easier to do. It's a lot more interesting to study for. And we can obviously speak a little bit more to that through future webinars, which we will. I know we will. When it comes to the resources here, I guess I'll say this in short, there's really no great answer. There's a lot of different types of resources that exist. You can see a few listed here. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. The real recipe for success for Step 2 CK comes from a year-long study journey, beginning with your first clinical rotation and ending with the end of your last one. Preparation for this exam begins on the first day of your clinical rotations and really ends on the last day. And you will have check-ins of how well you're mastering this material by taking your shelf exams throughout your curriculum. Prepare for the shelf exams as if they were the step exam. I say this because they have a large to do with how you're going to do in that clinical specialty. And as Joe had summarized earlier in the presentation, clinical grades will become quite important. They are already quite important when choosing residents for programs. Now, certainly even more so that step 1 is out of the question. But because these shelf exams have such a high bearing on what your overall course grade will be, it would behoove you to study for this as if it were a step exam. Do well on your shelf, master this material in the time that you have allocated to study for it. And then by the time step 2 preparation comes along, you will have a phenomenal foundation of all of the material you need. Having a major resource, a book or a set of videos or whatever that may be, on hand to read something or go through something every day of that clinical rotation is going to be your best friend. I'm not going to say it's easy. Certain rotations certainly limit the amount of time that you're going to be able to dedicate to studying. For example, surgery or OB, where you might be working nights or at the hospital for long periods of the day, especially if you're trying to impress on that rotation because you may want to be an OBGYN or a general surgeon. That's going to take away from some of that study time. But you're really going to want to maximize whatever time you have off the rotation, whether that be on weekends or after you're home, or maybe even a little earlier in the morning to review something to keep up your skill. Joe, anything to comment on this?
Yeah, I'll simply throw in there too, similar to step 1 preparation, UWorld takes front and center. There are thousands of questions in the Q bank for step 2 as well. And just to reiterate, step 2 is a numerical value that you are going to use in your application, and it's going to matter quite a bit. So just like we suggested, step 1 requires a substantial amount of study time to the point where many people take a couple of months for dedicated study towards step 1. You would also anticipate that you want to take a very large amount of time, if possible, for dedicated study towards step 2. Some of you might have heard that step 2, like step 1 preparations, like 2 months, 2 weeks, bring a number 2 pencil for step 3, meaning that you should prepare a lot for step 1, a little bit for step 2, and then just walk in and take step 3 when you're ready to take it. That's been shifting for a while now. And I would argue that whatever time you might need to study for step 1, you'll probably need a similar amount of dedicated time for step 2 as well. So step 1 was your practice territory to learn how to use resources like UWorld, learn how to learn this material. Preparing for step 2 is the real thing. You should anticipate that step 2 also requires a large amount of preparation. So for those of you who are preparing for both of these exams after having graduated at a medical school outside the US, it's a long journey. It's a lot to prepare for, and it's a difficult recommendation to make, but you should plan to set aside a couple of months for each exam. So even after you take step 1, you got a lot more to prepare for when it comes to step 2. Yeah, that's all I got to say on that, Fred. You can take us forward here.
No, that's perfect. When it comes to the breakdown of the exam, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide here, but basically what this is showing is how the different subspecialties and different subject matter is divided over the course of step 2. And this gives you a little bit of insight in what is more heavily weighted in terms of the number of questions that you'll expect to answer. Notice how medicine tends to be the dominating force of this exam. It's about 50% to 60% of the exam questions. And then the other ones, while a little bit lower in percentage, realize that all of the questions generally harken back to the medical management of the surgical patient, the pediatric patient, the OBGYN patient, and the psychiatric patient, as well as the general medicine patient. Understanding medicine and all of the subspecialties of medicine will poise you in a great position to do excellent on step 2 CK, even if you don't remember some of the nuances of surgical subject matter or a couple of OBGYN details. Oftentimes, the subjects that you spend a little bit less time on your rotations, I think these include pediatrics, OBGYN, and psychiatry, tend to be attenuated duration versus medicine and surgery. And it's reflected appropriately on the exam. There are going to be a handful of concepts that you will need to know backwards and forwards in some of these lesser spent specialties, but they are easy to learn. UWorld will absolutely take you through them and hammer them into your consciousness. And you will be very, very, very well prepared for this test. Joe, anything to add about the breakdown?
No, excellently stated. Medicine is the most important thing. You'll spend the majority of your time there, basically.
Mm-hmm. So in summary, wrapping up before our Q&A, we're going to say that, the change to pass fail is a new territory. We really don't know what's going to happen, especially with the IMGs who have used step 1 over the past several years to really augment their applications and get themselves into a position where they could be looked at by program directors. Shifting to a pass-fail system will obviously have some ramifications, but there are a lot of things you can do before any program director sees that application. And rest assured that now that it will be pass-fail, there is no more filter based on step 1 score that a program can use to weed you out. If they're going to use a filter, it's probably going to be based on clinical material that you have demonstrated that you know quite well in step 2 CK, which in my mind is a far better indicator of clinical reasoning and judgment. In your clinical rotations, you're going to want to earn those excellent letters of recommendation. You're going to want to try to engage in volunteerism and research if those opportunities are open to you. Again, I will not say that it's a requirement to do anything here to guarantee you a spot, because as we saw from the graphs, it's unclear about the significance of those kinds of things. But really performing well in your clinical grades, studying for the shelf exams as if they are your step 2 CK, trying to read or study something every single day to really boost your chances of understanding that clinical material that won't just help you for the step, but will help you for your career, will garner those excellent letters of recommendation and will get you onto a path that you need to be for a great residency spot. We know that step 2 CK is going to be an important test, but you all have the capability of doing phenomenally on it. And I think rather than motivation, you may want to consider a requirement to apply to residency with a step 2 CK score in hand. This is going to be real important, especially for IMGs, because we have to think of a way, and I say we because I was an IMG, we have to think about ways that we can separate ourselves from our US medical graduate counterparts. And the step 2 CK will be that numeric objective score and something that all of you are capable of doing phenomenally on. Joe, have I missed anything?
No, you nailed it.
All right, well, now it's the time that everybody enjoys. Again, at MST, we're here to talk. If you want to talk about strategy or whatever you can do to boost your score, talk about anxieties about the medical school process, the residency process, the application process, matching, anything, or just someone to kind of chat with and see if they can offer advice to help you get over something that's difficult, you let us know. We're here to help. As I said before, you are all our colleagues. We are excited to help you. We were once in your shoes. Joe and I feel the pain and know what it's like. So we are here at your will to guide us as the best we can help you. And we are super excited to do that and willing. And, it really is kind of a labor of love. It's like a passion that we have, right, Joe?
Absolutely. Yeah. I still keep in touch with tons of students that I've worked with for the last few years as they moved on to residency themselves. It's a really strong connection that we make with some students that we work with. And we'd be happy to, tutors like myself and Fred, we'd be happy to work with you as well if we can help in any way to make your way through your medical education. That being said, Med School Tutors also offers just specific one-time preparation, strategy formation, schedule formation sessions as well. So if you have any need for any extra support as you make your way through your medical journey, feel free to reach out to Med School Tutors. We're happy to help however we can. Now that we've gone through our spiel, we have some questions to answer. Thank you guys for sending in questions here. We got a couple of pretty good ones, and I'm going to go ahead and jump in to answer some of the stuff that you guys have been sending. If you have any questions, by the way, send them in now while we have a couple moments to answer them. We'll do the best we can to answer everything you guys send our way. So first thing that somebody just sent in, there are some schools outside the US that will nevertheless require or ask students to take a preparatory exam before taking step one, CBSE exam, for example. And one question is asking, well, what if my school says that there's a cutoff value that I have to earn on the CBSE in order to take step one, in order for them to certify me taking the exam? So if there's a, let's say, CBSE exam that the NBME provides and the minimum passing score is a 210 on that, if I get a 210 on that, is that applicable to step one? The answer is yes, it is applicable to step one. If you take a preparatory exam through the NBME, whether it's a CBSE exam provided by your school or a CBSSA practices exam that you purchase individually online from the NBME, either way, those scores are reflective of the real thing. The one thing that I would caution here, though, is that any exam, step one itself for that matter, has variance, meaning that if you took step one 5 times in a row, you might get 5 different numerical scores as it currently stands. And so what is the variance on an NBME practice test? It could be pretty substantial, which is why you'll find that even though the passing threshold for step one is a 194 at the moment and will be a 196, if your program offers a CBSE, they might say, you need a 210 on that thing before we let you go take step one, because that's when we're pretty sure that you're going to pass the exam. So for students who are considering taking step one, even though they have a prerequisite CBSE or preparatory exam, if you get a score that's a 205 or a 210 on an NBME certified practice assessment, you are very likely to pass the exam, in which case stepping up to take the exam is probably a good idea at that point under the pass-fail guidelines. Follow-up question to that, long question, appreciate it. Okay, so let's say that we take step one, we pass it, and we are now going to supply our application to residency. If step one's pass-fail, does that impact matching into what might be considered historically not as competitive fields? Examples provided by the student or family medicine, psychiatry, for instance. Would the chances of matching into those specialties be the same? Does it get worse for IMGs now that we move into the pass-fail future? The answer is, if you were going to earn a 250 on step one, you now no longer have the opportunity to demonstrate that score to residency programs. That's a really high mark to make, for instance, but strong performance on step one no longer provides any benefit. So you lose the opportunity for a benefit. That doesn't mean you always lose a benefit, though, because not everybody's going to get a 250 on step one. You lose the opportunity to distinguish yourself on step one. Now, for some students, that was never really going to be much of an opportunity anyway, and not having to worry about capturing that opportunity frees up some time. So in one way, yes, you are losing the potential at an advantage, but you still have the same capacity to use step two for that self-same purpose, which is to have a high 3-digit value to send to residency programs. Long story short, you are not impaired in applying to residency because of the pass-fail change, although we do lose an avenue for distinction, which can sometimes be frustrating. Finally, last little thing on that, if you're passing a practice assessment with like a 210, when should you take the exam? You're ready at that point. Now, if you want to just further solidify your likelihood of passing, instead of being 90% certain you're going to pass, but 95% certain, you can keep studying, keep preparing, especially if you don't have any deadline. But if deadline's approaching and you're getting like a 210 on practice assessments, you're probably prepared. You should be preparing to take a practice assessment and then take the exam after that if the practice assessment is satisfactory. That was a lot for me, Fred. You got any questions you want to answer on your end?
I'm answering many of them in the chat. Many of these are specific questions.
Okay.
Not necessarily universally around, but somebody is asking from the perspective of a non-US IMG. One, how do you get excellent letters of recommendation as a US IMG or a non-US IMG? That's going to be from doing your clinical rotations, working well with these attending physicians at US hospitals. I emphasize US hospitals because you are trying to do a residency in the US. So that is where these letters are best coming from. Sometimes you can get letters of recommendation from people in your home country or elsewhere, maybe where you've done medical school or something like that. They may not be as helpful simply just because the way letters of recommendation work is that medicine is often a very small community. People can read letters of recommendation that were written by their colleagues or friends from medical school, and rather than read something all the way through, they can call that person up and say, hey, how was this person on rotation? So I emphasize, if you have the opportunity to do an away rotation in a US hospital somewhere, get a letter of recommendation from it, certainly. That is going to amplify your chances of having a successful match. Similarly, when it comes to research experiences, it doesn't really matter where these research experiences have taken place. It really just depends upon the quality and your contribution to it. So I would say that it is probably better to have presented at a conference, whether that be a poster or an oral presentation. I think that's a great way to have some experience as a medical student. It doesn't really put the whole burden of you having to publish a manuscript. Of course, having manuscripts on your CV is always very helpful, but any kind of academic pursuit on an application is going to be beneficial for you. There is no limitations for what that includes. Just do something rather than nothing if you have the opportunity. And then lastly, there was another question about difference between letters of recommendation coming from a hospital and a clinic. No, there is no difference. It just needs to come from a physician.
Yeah, I'll pivot off of that. There's another interesting question asking if I had the opportunity to delay my graduation date so as to take more clinical rotations and possibly get letters of recommendation from that, would it be worthwhile to do so? Really hard question to answer, unfortunately. It really depends on your individual circumstances. My basic recommendation is if you have the opportunity to get more letters from good letter writers, then you should probably take that opportunity, especially if you're not feeling particularly sanguine about the letters that you currently have. What I mean by good letters, though, really depends. If you have the opportunity to do a rotation at your institution, again, maybe not super useful if you've already earned a letter of recommendation from your institution. If you have an opportunity to do an away rotation at a program that you really want to match into and you haven't gone there before, awesome opportunity. Yes, you should take that, because if you can impress them, that is going to open the door to getting an interview and really potentially solidify your chances of matching at that program. So if the question is, should I be doing more rotations to get more letters? Well, it depends. More rotations with the same people you've already met? Probably not. They probably already like you after you've worked with them for a month or so. More rotations specifically at a program that you are trying to target? Then absolutely yes. So kind of a wishy-washy answer, just really depends on your individual circumstances, not really a yes or no on that one.
I'll add one other thing to that, though, too. If you have letters of recommendation, realize that ERAS is really only going to let you can upload as many as you want to ERAS, but the limit is really cut off at 3. And most residency programs will say, please don't send us any more than 3. So when it comes to asking for letters, I do recommend asking quite liberally for them. Having more letters is always great. You can pick and choose which ones you want to send to certain places. But if you are going to do additional clinical rotations and delay your graduation date or delay your application date. Realize that delaying your graduation date may mean that you're probably not going to match in that current cycle, in which case those letters that you apply with the following year will be old. They're going to want to see an update of what you did in that gap year, if that's what it comes to. So strive for at least 3 letters of recommendation, and really strive for good clinical grades and a good step 2 CK score. I think if you have something reputable to produce on those 3 fronts, you should be pretty solid for most applications to residency in the coming season.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I saw here, which actually is really relevant to a lot of IMGs, is it really feasible to prepare for step 1 or step 2 for that matter while working? Maybe as a research assistant, maybe while working on clinical rotations, maybe while just doing any kind of other occupation to earn money in between applying to residency. The answer is it really is difficult. It's not impossible though. Many people do prepare for these exams while also having a full-time job or familial commitments or a variety of other things that prevent them from treating step 1 and step 2 as their actual full-time job. My only recommendation there is that if you are going to attempt to prepare for step 1 with something else taking a large portion of your daily time, recognize that you are going to have to be as
I'll let Joe kind of come back when he can, because he was making a good point. I'm going to go to a couple of other questions here that I see. I will say though about letters of recommendation, I'm seeing a lot of questions come in about letters of rec. I'm going to actually defer those questions to another webinar that we will certainly do about applying to residency in the future. We do webinars all year long. They are always free. Information just to be able to hand out to you guys. We will absolutely talk about the application process and how to get LORs and what you want to strategically do with them. I'll ask you to hang on to those questions for that time, because they are a bit off topic for what we're talking about tonight. So we won't answer any more letters of recommendation topics or questions, just because they're a bit outside of the subject material for tonight's webinar. But definitely stay tuned and tune into other webinars that we do, because we will address those specifically and in far more detail for you. Joe, we missed you, but I made sure that Faith caught an amazing screenshot of your face frozen, because it was quite good.
Wonderful, excellent. I made it almost the entire time, so I apologize everybody for cutting out there, but meeting us over the internet is what it is.
How dare you,
is there anything else that I can supply to the answer that I was about to give when I cut out, or are we all set on that, Fred?
I think that was pretty solid.
Okay, cool.
I'm not really seeing too many other questions here. I guess one peripherally related, and this will be, I think, maybe the last one of the night, but do programs look poorly on people who have taken a break in their education to study for STEP? I'm going to say no. I think a leave of absence for whatever reason is a personal reason, and really nothing that you have to necessarily explain. It may come up in your interview, so you may want to be prepared to answer that. But if your answer is something quite thoughtful, like, I felt like I needed to put the time in to really prepare for this exam in the right way, then that's I think a very reasonable one, and you knew your limitations and you did something to accommodate for it. But in the realm of a pass-fail step score here, your goal now is not necessarily to get a 260 or a 270 on step 1 anymore. Your goal is to pass, the bar being a bit lower than what it used to be in the past for these kinds of things. So if people see that you're putting in abnormal amounts of levels of anxiety to earn a P on an exam that is now just pass or fail, that may raise some questions as well. So have a plan, study for it, know that the exam will be a pass and that you're striving for a pass, but prepare for it adequately in the time that your school allows. And I promise you that the majority of people who really do a good job in the 6 to 8 week period that we recommend for studying for step 1 will do quite well and pass the exam. Joe, anything to add before we wrap up tonight?
I'll simply say thank you, everybody, for hanging with us for our long conversation this evening, and thank you for supplying questions to us and being engaged in the process. We really appreciate the stuff that you sent into the chat. I'll also mention really quickly, just to satisfy our behind-the-scenes operator here, feel free to provide some feedback with the link that we just sent for a survey. Any feedback you guys give us can make us better at doing this, hopefully in the future. So please take the time it takes to answer one UWorld question to jump in there and give us some feedback if there's anything we can improve for the future. Otherwise, again, thank you so much for staying with us. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for being engaged. We wish you the best of luck as you prepare for these exams and move on to apply to residency. And we hope to someday see you on the wards, but I'll leave the last word to Fred to wrap this up for this evening.
And that was beautiful. I really don't have anything else to add, but no, I share Joe's sentiments. You all are rock stars. Keep doing what you're doing. As an IMG, to my audience of IMGs out there, I know what you're experiencing. I know the stresses that come with it. I was once you, and it is possible to do quite well and have very wonderful careers in medicine. You're all taking on a very noble undertaking. You're all taking a very difficult pathway to get there. So I salute you all for doing that, but know that your patients need you because you empathize in a way that many can't. So keep up the good work, keep working very hard, keep working smart. We are here to answer questions or just vent to or give strategy. If you need that, you know how to reach us. There's our contact information at the bottom of the slide. And with that, I'll say good night.